Hello and welcome to this quick video in the Painless Answers series. This one is to answer a question from a patron of mine called Simon. Now Simon wants to put multiple cameras, dual cameras, on an FPV setup. So with an analog FPV, rather than have one single camera, he wants to have maybe one pointing forward, one pointing down, or one pointing forward and one pointing backwards. And that good news is, Simon, it is absolutely doable. In fact, there's a couple of ways to do it, and I'll go through those in the video. So the first way that you can do it is by using something called a camera switcher. This is a little switch that connects the two signals from the two cameras and outputs it to your flight controller, and you can switch between the two signals by using a control of some description. Second way to do it is a lot of the modern Maytech flight controllers and flight controllers from other people now have the ability to plug in two cameras, and you can select which camera you want to view via the software, either iNav or something like Betaflight. There is one little wrinkle with this, in that modern FPV goggle modules, things like the Rapid Fire, things like the Fusion, reconstitute each video frame on the fly using very clever algorithms, using things like the sync pulse and the color data and things from each of the antennas both at the same time to reconstitute the best, cleanest frame of video that it possibly can. Now, while that is incredibly useful and can make sure that you still get a signal even when both antennas are only getting half of the picture, it does mean that with dual camera setups, it doesn't work particularly well. If you have one camera that's running one cycle and the other camera that's running on the other cycle, the fact that they're not perfectly in sync will cause the module to lose the plot. So if you have one of the really expensive modules in your goggles, things like the Rapid Fire or the Fusion, you're going to have to turn the super duper stuff off and just use it as a basic dumb diversity receiver, and it'll still work fine. Other top tip is, if you're going to set this up, make sure that both the cameras are either set to PAL or they're both set to NTSC. Don't have one on PAL and one on NTSC. That will just make everything incredibly complicated. And finally, I'm not aware of a way to do this with the DJI HD FPV kit. If you are and you've got it working, I'd love to hear from you. This is all about analog, so let's get in a couple of slides. So very quickly, let's talk about how normal analog FPV works. You have the camera plugged into the flight controller, the video signal goes from the camera to the flight controller, the on-screen display is added, it's output to the video transmitter, and that's transmitted down to your goggles. The way it works, if you have a dual camera support on a modern flight controller, so check out some of my builds on things like the Maytech flight controllers. I put a dual camera setup onto my NanoDrac build actually from autumn last year. It's dead easy. You just plug both cameras into both of the inputs, and then within the settings in Betaflight or iNav, it goes through how you set this up very nicely on the Maytech website. You can choose between them, and you can even in some instances actually also enable and disable the power for the second camera too. However, my advice would be don't do that, because most cameras take a finite amount of period to boot up, and you want the camera running so you can just flick to it and have the image there ready for you. Now, doing it with a flight controller like this is super simple, and that's the way that I did it in that NanoDrac build, but sadly, as I said, it's not something that I use because I use the Rapid Fire and Fusion receivers in my goggles, and I have to remember to turn them from really smart, expensive modules to basic diversity modules in order for the second image to still be seeable. If you don't have a flight controller that has dual inputs, then the other option is to use something like a camera switcher. Now, Hobby King used to do these things, and I've looked at them on the channel. And the way it works is that you plug the video out from each of the cameras into your camera switcher. Some camera switchers have 2 inputs, some have 3. And then out the camera switcher, you connect the video out into your flight controller. Now, the way it's usually controlled is via a PWM signal. So in the case of having 3 cameras connected to it, or 3 inputs, it's usually in the low value of PWM, you get one of the channels, middle you get the other, and high channel value for PWM you get the third video input, and you just change them like that. It's pretty easy to set up. There's a little bit more wiring, a little bit more involved. You can of course plug the camera switcher into either a spare output on your flight controller and forward a channel, just like I did in the pan and tilt video, or you can if you don't have a flight controller at all, you can still use a camera switcher, because you just plug the control for the camera switcher into a spare channel on the receiver. So then you can connect that to one of the switches on your radio and just flick that switch to directly change which camera is being put into the flight controller. It is a little bit more complex to wire up, and care is needed for the voltages, because you need to make sure that each camera is getting the voltage that you need. However, modern cameras have a pretty wide voltage range, so you should be fine. So, Simon, hopefully that helps. Couple of final thoughts. Although this is a cool idea in principle, for me, I've set it up on a number of models and I don't really use it. As I said, predominantly because I'm using a smart module in my analog FPV goggles. If you do use this, remember to turn off all the funky stuff and just have them act as a basic diversity receiver, and it'll still work. It'll resync to the second image when you switch from one camera to the other. Obviously, if you're going to install another camera that's not pointing out to where you are flying towards, ideally you want some kind of flight control software that can fly autonomously. This could be particularly handy, I guess, if you're doing something like a mission with either Ardu plane or iNav and you're flying autonomously. You could have another camera that either look backwards or look down on the ground. That would be a nice way to do it and would minimize the risk of not looking where you're going. Do watch for power requirements. The Matek flight controllers that have support for multiple cameras have thought of all this, so there's more than enough power available to run multiple cameras at the same time without causing a problem. Other flight controllers that only have a very small battery eliminator circuit or 5 or 9 volts designed for one camera, probably going to get a little bit upset if you start adding multiple cameras and trying to draw from that same output. So be aware of that. Look at the current in the specs for the cameras that you're using. Make sure that both of those currents are less than the rating of the battery eliminator circuit on the flight controller. If in doubt, add a separate 5 volt BEC to run the second camera, and then you should be fine. And last point, just to reiterate, again, if you already have one of the super duper modules like the Rapid Fire or Fusion, this won't work unless you turn them into £20–30 diversity receivers. So be aware of that, and if you kind of keep within those caveats, you should have a great time with it. Thank you for spending your time today watching that video. You can find me in all the usual places on social media, and if you're trying to learn about a subject, then check out the playlist. All of my videos are organized into easy to follow playlists that, if you're trying to learn a topic, will take you from the basics right the way through to some pretty advanced stuff.